Weapon H just dropped, and he is a lethal weapon. Weapon H is a 7/14 with an ability that says when it is discarded, it goes back into your hand at -2 cost. I think this card compares pretty reasonably to something like Scar, a similar 7 cost that gets cheaper. Although I think Scar perhaps is rewarding you for doing something that is more baseline good to do. Weapon H gives you a lot of upside in the context of tying into a discard deck that already has a ton of stats available. Largely, Weapon H is a traditional discard card. Apocalypse, Khonshu, Weapon H, sometimes two of the three, but that's generally the vibe here. It's not a Bullseye Dakin discard card, it is a Dracula discard card. There are other things you can do with this card in this space. It's not just a discard card, but it is enough of just a discard card that the way I'm going to structure this video is I'm going to talk about Weapon H, I'm going to talk about the various decks you can put him in, and I'm going to do a card-by-card breakdown on the discard deck that I played to get back into the top 50 exclusively playing with Weapon H. So, with all of that said, I do think that this is a very solid card if you are an Apocalypse lover, if you are a Lady Sif lover, if you are, more than anything, a Corvus Glaive Morbius lover. That is what this is a card for. That is who this is for. It is a sort of Proxima Midnight-esque card, where I think that it is very specifically for the thing that it goes in, but honestly, the thing that it goes in is pretty good. So if you're looking for purchase advice, that's kind of the space that I would think about this card in. Personally, I think it's a little bit better than Proxima Midnight, but it reminds me of what Proxima Midnight was when Proxima Midnight came out. So if you want to think about it in those terms, I think that's probably a smart thing to do. This is the list that I played almost exclusively up into the top 50. I ended up messing around with the Lady Sif versus MODOK slot, but I really ended up liking how this list played out in terms of what it was able to do and how consistently it was able to do it. The biggest play tip I have for you with this deck, and largely with a lot of the decks that are going to look like this, because we're going to look at a couple of other things and the differences between them and why those choices are being made when it comes to this Weapon H card. But this is a card, or this is a deck that really wants you to get the value out of your discards when you can, because a lot of the time what's going to happen is something like a Zombie Power Man is just going to eat them up anyway. If you have a profitable blade, just go ahead and do that. Keep in mind that whenever you discard a card that comes back to your hand, it comes back on the right of your hand, so managing the left of your hand with Zombie Power Man is a very important part of expressing your skill in this deck, such as it is. Being willing to risk discarding things, knowing that Khonshu could bring them back, is a really important part of this deck. Khonshu actually might be the most important card in this deck, because the goal here is to get a Dracula down, get rid of your stuff, play a Khonshu and a Weapon H that presumably costs 1 with your ability to have 7 energy thanks to Corvus Glaive. Very much a Corvus Khonshu deck. This deck has a ton of power output. I think it manages to occupy a similar space between Ramp and Scar decks, where it's halfway between Ramp and Scar. Ramp has more interaction, Scar has less interaction. This deck has a ton of points built in, is largely what I'm trying to say. There are a lot of matchups where you will just be able to snap because your opponent is probably playing something smaller than you. I was sort of instantly snapping. My opponent played like a Power Stone on turn 1. That's a snap on turn 2, as long as my hand is functional. There's just a lot of just really big numbers in this deck. It is effectively just going to vomit a ton of points. Being able to play a Dracula is an obviously powerful power spike when so many people are relying on things like Shadow King and Deafening Chord. Not the greatest thing for them. Now, granted, the ramp decks do have access to Enchantress and Cosmic Ghost Rider, both of which are pretty good against this deck, but the numbers this deck is able to get to make it so that even I won a game against ramp where I got Enchantress into Cosmic Ghost Rider, still won the game. Largely, I think that is due to the way I put this deck together, which is not just built for putting all the points power, all the possible point cards in there, which we definitely did do. Morbius, we have Zombie Colonel America, or Zombie Captain America, or Colonel America, or whatever his name actually is, and the 3 guys at the top of the curve alongside a Dracula, just maximum points. but also a relatively lower curve to help you be better able to manage your zombie power man. This means that you're going to be able to, if you play Corvus Glaive, play a 3/3 on turn 5, which means actually it's not as important to play Corvus Glaive on 3, but it is quite important to get him down by 4. So very often you can play a more targeted discard like Lady Sif on 3, play Corvus Glaive and a Blade on 4, and then on 5 you do something else. You can very often have success as well by swapping out Lady Sif for a MODOK. Full disclosure, this is the list I'm going to be doing a card-by-card breakdown on, so with that said, let's jump into a couple other lists. This isn't a bad Black Knight card, I'm just not convinced Black Knight is a good enough deck to do what you want to do with this. Black Knight is a deck that actually, I think, got pretty hurt by the loss of a couple of cheap tech cards that were pretty reliable for it. This is a deck that always had a sort of points and minimal tech investment package. And now, if it's just a points deck, it ends up stacking up a bit poorly. There are cool things you can do here, though, like Isan will pull a Black Knighted whatever, like that's a sick thing to do. If you can get to that level of power where you have Isan pulling a Redshift card, you have Isan pulling a Valentina card, you have Isan pulling a Black Knight card, you're putting like 25 power down in one lane, you're going to be able to make a ton of power put on the board. You can play Isan in like a discounted Weapon H in your like ultimate dream scenarios. There's a lot of points here. But it's, and while I will say, your good draws will give you more points than the ramp decks. They will give you more points than a lot of things. Your bad draws are kind of non-functional, and that is actually a problem. Like, you do have this thing where it's like you're going through a lot of effort to get what I would argue the discard deck that we just talked about gets in terms of point output with a similar level of no interacting with your opponent. And if you want to be able to do this kind of power level with interacting with your opponent, I mean, the ramp deck is right there. It can reach these heights too. It can just play the Infinite a lot of the time. It can have those 27 power final turns. It can actually make that happen. I think that largely what this deck runs into is not a problem with Weapon H. It's a problem with the deck's premise. It's just, we're just not in a world where this deck can be as functional as you would want it to be. What this deck was really good at doing is trying to beat sort of mid-rangey tech decks by outputting points that dodged their tech late in the game and outputting a lot of those points very cheaply. That's kind of the deal here. Like, oh, you discard the card, you play the Black Knight, you play the Weapon H after you play your Sarah, you play your Ghost Rider, you play your Black Knight card, like all that kind of stuff. That's old Marvel Snap. We don't do that anymore in 2025. That's not what this metagame is about. And it's not to say like this deck is fundamentally flawed per se. It's just not built for right now. The Helicarrier list is definitely leaning on some big, beefy discards. Weapon H is not a bad inclusion in this list, but it's also a little bit of a conflict. Like, this is a deck that is going to get a lot out of a zombie power man, but it's also going to fill its hand up in ways that are pretty awkward. You're going to have to do a lot of hand management here. This is already a deck that I think might not want to be discarding as much. It wants to do some targeted discards, make sure you hit the right stuff, and I'm not sure adding Weapon H is necessarily making it better, but this is a deck that I think is similarly positioned to the BK deck, although maybe a little bit better positioned because it just has more numbers in it. The basic idea here is just larger numbers. Like, we want to do as many numbers as we possibly can. So we have Helicarrier V-Hand. We have this big, gigantic dork that is Weapon H. Weapon H's best friend, by the way, and this does bear mentioning, is Corvus Glaive. Corvus Glaive, of course, not just giving you extra energy, but it's extra energy that means that on the final turn of the game, you have an odd number of energy, which is usually pretty important because this guy's always at an odd number, and a lot of the other things that you put in these decks end up being at even numbers, so you're very often going to be doing something like, I don't know, in various Weapon H decks, this is not just for this deck, it's kind of more of a general thing, like you have this odd number of energy that's important because you want to play a Dracula and a Weapon H, or you want to play a 6-drop and a 1-cost Weapon H, or you see where I'm getting with this? Like, a lot of the best things you do with this guy end up having an odd number of energy involved in them for reasons that don't actually make a ton of sense to me, but I think are mostly built into the way in which 3-drops are constructed for discard. There really aren't that many that are like a billion points. It's just kind of zombie Captain America, and then everything else in discard that has stats is a 2, a 4, or a 6, and I think that's a big part of it. But that is something that really stuck out about why Corvus Glaive is so important. It's not just the discard, it's also the fact that he lets you do all this stuff. This is a deck that is outputting points in a very similar way to the other versions of discard, but it does so in a less predictable and less understandable way. So I think you see this deck doing things and you think it must be worse than it is, which means this deck has some pretty massive snap equity because it genuinely does have a ton of powerful hands. Danish alt build here. Because he is Danish, he leaned very hard into Grandmaster. Grandmaster does a couple of things here. The first is getting rid of, okay, I get the double gambit. That's cool. I'm Danish. I love doing that anyway. The other thing this card does is gets you double Khonshu. Double Khonshu is actually super messed up, and you do have to be thinking about that in terms of board space the entire game. But if you can pull off a double Khonshu, that is a big banger of a play. It's not a guaranteed anything, but double Khonshu is super sick. Being able to double Gambit is super sick, and that is enough to keep Grandmaster in the list for sure. I think this is a probably more balanced build of Weapon H. It might even be a better build of Weapon H than the one that I played. I think it does a lot of stuff really well and puts a lot of points on the board really consistently. So I would argue that this is a pretty sick deck that does pretty sick things, and you should definitely take a look at it if you're looking for an alternate build on how to play Weapon H, and maybe if you didn't get Zombie Colonel America. On to the card by card, starting with Scorn. This card is just here to be discarded and do some stuff. You just need a certain volume of stuff that you're happy to discard. Scorn is absolutely a card that you are extremely happy to discard. You're very rarely going to be getting like a billion discards of this. I think the highest I ever got her was 10. And sometimes you're going to have to chuck her out of the hand in order to hit the stuff you want to hit with a Zombie Power Man, but still just a pretty good card to have. Play Blade for value. Just play him and get him out of the way. Just do what you got to do when it comes to Blade, because he is a very interesting card that I think a lot of people will want to save for, a better hit or whatever. And it just never ends up working out that way. Whenever you have a hit of Blade that is actually reasonable, just play him. Just make it happen. Like, you just got to get your discard procs off when you can. Get that to happen and do it as fast as you can almost all of the time. When you're hitting Apocalypse, do it. When you're hitting anything bigger than a Scorn, probably, I would just fire the guy off, because a lot of the time, the rest of the time, he's going to sit in hand until turn 3, and on turn 3, you might be playing Gambit, you might be playing something like a Corvus Glaive, and then you might be discarding your Blade, and it's like, well, I wish I'd actually just played that guy. Where Morbius is here to get to a more billion power. He's actually not as big as in the decks where you're doing swarm stuff, but I don't really think you care. This deck is built not for Morbius. He's just supposed to be like a 2/8, a 2/10. He's your chamber, effectively. Just big guy. He goes there. He is big. That's really it. He's a large man. He is large and in charge, but he's not like the biggest guy ever the way he is in some of the more combo-oriented discard decks. He's just a really big 2. Zombie Power Man is kind of amazing with this extra target, and part of the reason I've built the deck this way with no MODOK is so that I have more small cards to play out to manipulate what's getting hit by the Zombie Power Man. This guy's really good. Like, you're very often just going to put him in a location, get a discard off of him, be able to reinforce him, put Zombie Power Man, play Zombie Colonel America in the same space, and it's just like, that's a really hard thing to deal with. Those are really strong cards in combination with each other. They really do work, and like, it's pretty clear they were released to work together, and they really do. This card is so strong in this deck that it honestly has me regretting not getting the Rian Gonzalez variant for it. I think I got it for every other zombie card, but I was like, oh, I'll never play Power Man. Wrong. Idiot. Dumb. This guy's just a big guy. Like, you don't always have full lanes, but you can pretty often make sure that one of them happens. And in that world, since you aren't really repeating discards that much, this guy is pretty close to like a 3-cost Morbius, where it's just like you fill this up and you're getting +3 for every card you discarded most of the time, because you're really not very often going to be discarding more than one card a turn anyway. So in this list, his relative value is honestly much, much higher than in the lists that are making Morbius, 10 jillion power. And like, those lists would probably rather be playing Collector, because the way you do that is with Swarm and things like that. I think if you're not doing that stuff, this guy is honestly pretty legit. Do I think he is required? No, I mean, I think you could play the Danish version of this deck and get MODOK and get a Grandmaster in here, and like, that's probably a fine thing to do as well. I don't think you need to go out there and buy this to play this deck, but I was pretty surprised by how good this guy really was. Nobody's surprised by how good Gambit is. He blows things up and isn't afraid of anybody. This guy is obviously very good in this deck. You're very happy. You have a million targets in hand such that he is almost never actually hurting you. So he mostly just reads, blow something up, and that's really good. Corvus Glaive is an interesting card. I will sometimes prioritize, say, a Lady Sif over him. Like, for example, if I have a Khonshu in hand at 5 and I'm worried I won't be able to get that card to 12, I'll play a Lady Sif on 3 and then a Corvus maybe with a Blade on 4. And then the idea is I'll just Khonshu back whatever. That's kind of what this guy is doing. It's also important that you get things that are discardable with or are revivable with Khonshu when you're doing plays like that. So keep that in mind as well. This is a really interesting card, and I think it's probably Weapon H's best possible friend, because really all this deck is trying to do is output as many points as possible, whether that means, you know, Dracula and a 3-cost Weapon H on the final turn of the game, or a 6-drop and a 1-cost Weapon H on the final turn of the game. This guy unlocks all of it, even a Morbius and a 5-cost Weapon H on the final turn of the game. I've won games with every single one of those plays. I've chosen to play Lady Sif here instead of MODOK. I don't know if I'm right about that. I think it's an interesting decision. I can't say it's like the greatest decision I've ever made. I've been happy with it. I tried MODOK. I tried Sif. I didn't feel an appreciable difference other than that with MODOK, it was harder. It was easier to get things into my graveyard. I'd be willing to believe that MODOK is a better card. The thing is, it's just such a worse card with zombie Power Man specifically, because then you're really counting on having a Khonshu to get the MODOK back. And if you're doing that, it means you're counting on having a Corvus Glaive in order to be able to play the Khonshu early enough to get the MODOK back. Like, there's just enough awkwardness in here that I was happy to play the smoother version of the deck, but I'm willing to believe that the more beefy version of the deck, like what Dennis was playing, is a viable strategy too. Dracula's big as hell. Don't get Cosmic Ghost Ridered, but this guy is one of the biggest cards in the entire game. You really need him in order to just hit something with Apocalypse, but like I've had hands where like my final turn is gonna involve Dracula hitting either Apocalypse or a 10-power Scorn or a Khonshu or something like that. Like, there's just a lot of good hits in hand. He's just very often like a 413, a 414, a 415, a 460. Pretty good card. Khonshu's kind of the glue of this deck, because if you're playing Zombie Power Man, the chances are you're probably going to discard something you actually care about, and it's probably going to be Gambit, and this guy is probably going to bring it back and probably going to ruin your opponent's life. This card is great in this list for recycling your accidents. There are a lot of cards in this deck that you want to discard. There are some that you don't. When you end up discarding those cards, Khonshu is what brings them back into play, especially if you're able to Corvus Glaive into Khonshuing on 5, get even more value out of that, and potentially even more discards for your turn 6. Apocalypse is mostly Dracula fuel. Like, I don't really think you're doing a lot with this guy other than Dracula fuel. You very often have better things to do otherwise. He's probably the most, like, I won't say like he's the most replaceable of the big guys, but he's the one where you're like, I really wish you were doing something other than just being Dracula fuel a lot of the time, because you're just going to rather play other stuff most of the time if you're not Draculaing this guy. The man of the hour, Weapon H, is just like a big guy, and you're interested in playing as many big guys as you can. The whole idea of this deck is just play big guys every single turn. Every turn you are above the curve, you are putting pressure on your opponent. You have no way of interacting with anything combo related, but like if their combo doesn't come together perfectly, your amount of power is going to be pretty good. Like, I beat a Living Tribunal deck that got like 25 power in every lane by just having more than 25 power in 2 lanes. Like, you could do that, right? Like, there are just some things that you can do. And that is a very reasonable thing to do when you have something that's like a 114 or a 314. And you can do a lot of stuff. This guy in a Dracula on the final turn of the game, busted. This guy in a Khonshu on the final turn of the game, that's like 35 power. You're super into all of those outcomes. Like, that kind of stuff, having all of this good early curve stuff being backed up by this really powerful late game stuff, that's the premise of the deck. Just as many points as you could possibly get. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.